Welcome to today's episode of EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll be covering a workforce built to last. We'll be hearing from Stacy Noblet of ICF and Davey Moen from Con Edison on what it takes to keep teams together, particularly during this crucial time in transportation electrification. Stacy and Davey have been with their companies for more than 15 years, and we're excited to hear about what it is about working at their companies that makes them stick around. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm super excited about this topic. And first thing I wanted to do before we do the norm is I wanted to share a little bit about why I wanted to talk about keeping people and attracting talent and keeping them on board, because it is a little bit unusual for us. Let's just say we're usually talking about policy here on EV Hub Live. And so, as a small business owner of Atlas Public Policy, I personally have experienced what it's like to try to build a team and try to keep people, because it's all about building capacity and trying to do innovative things. And so to do that, often you need to have the same people at your company for quite a while. What's going on in EVs and transportation electrification more broadly is just so unusual. This is a once in a century kind of opportunity. And, it can be really hard. It's a very competitive job market out there. I'm sure everybody's looking on LinkedIn, seeing people jumping around jobs all the time. And, it can be very challenging to build something from the ground up in a hyper competitive labor market. And so we wanted to bring on some folks who have been working at their companies for a long time to find out, why they are and to get some of the insights from them. So I'm really excited to get to them and just our guests in just a minute. But first, just a little bit about some of the data that I found in doing some research for this show. There was a recent study by the Workforce Sciences Institute and Mercer, and they actually did find that a company had a positive effect on productivity based on the tenure of the person there. So the longer you stayed at a company, the more productive you were. And that wasn't really a function of age, which I think is important. It might be slightly counterintuitive to folks, but the tenure of the person actually affected productivity. The other thing that I found that was kind of counterintuitive, and Mo, maybe you could bring this data up to show the audience, is that the median years of tenure at people's jobs right now is actually longer than it was 40 years ago. I found that to be quite surprising, because I think culturally we're all thinking people are moving jobs around quite a lot these days, but it is very high right now, relatively speaking. It was highest right after the 2008 recession, but it's still historically high. So let's bring our guests onto the show and get into the conversation now, both Stacy and Davey. I'd love to hear a little bit about how long you've been at your companies and what are some of the top reasons why you're still there. Let's start with Stacy.
Great. Thanks, Nick, for having me. Good to join Davey in this conversation. So I'm Stacy Noblet. I'm currently a vice president focused on transportation electrification with ICF. ICF is a global consulting firm. So we're everywhere in a lot of different industries, not just transportation, not just energy. And I think that's one of the reasons that I've probably been with ICF for so long, and I'll get into that. But May 10th is my 19th anniversary with the company.
Wow.
So I started right out of undergrad and started out as a research assistant, which is an entry-level position, moved all the way, through the ranks, and now vice president. So a couple of reasons why I've been there. I'd say first and foremost is the people. ICF has a great track record of hiring and retaining really top-notch people. So my teams have always been fantastic, close relationships, close knit. Also the clients that we've worked with, and certainly you all in the industry, really, great people who, inspire you to come to work every day and put in the hard stuff. Second has been the variety of opportunities I've had. So when I started out at ICF, I worked on clean transportation more broadly. Worked with the alternative fuels data center, with the Clean Cities program. Those, groups in themselves are really exciting places to be. We still do that work, thankfully,
Mhm.
and that gave me a variety of fuel types, of technology types to kind of get to know. I was able to focus more on transportation electrification the last couple of years, which is obviously a very exciting place to be. But through all of that, I've been able to take on different projects, different roles, work with different managers, different peers. So that variety, you don't stagnate in that environment, which has been one of the reasons to stay. And then I'd say third is just the growth potential and also the support to grow as a professional. ICF has a lot of talent development resources, but the mentorships, the relationships that you can establish within the organization, and then the opportunities that the company presents me, to interface with others outside of the company has kind of kept me learning and growing. And so again, it's important that even being in a company for so long, it's not a status quo kind of same thing every day. The consulting environment lends itself to the variety. So it's a great place to be, but certainly this industry in particular, keeps me excited and coming back and wanting to do new things.
Great. David, let's hear from you. You've been at Con Ed for a
Yeah,
while, I take it.
I have. So not quite as long as Stacy, but I've been at Con Edison for 15 years. So out of college, I joined Con Edison. I joined through the what's now called the Leadership Development Program. So it's sort of a rotational development program where get to do these 6-month rotations throughout the company, and they put you kind of all over. And at the end of each of those 6-month rotations, you give a presentation on kind of what you've learned, and the value that you sort of added. So it was really intense, really good experience. You make a lot of connections along the way. So after that, I got a real job at Con Ed, and have been there since then, in varying different capacities. I have a business background by education. So when I first came off the program, I started working in our energy management group, which deals with the day-to-day scheduling of electricity and natural gas. So you work with, or I personally worked with the NYISO, the New York Independent System Operator, got to work and understand a lot about how energy is supplied throughout the state. Super interesting. And from there, I moved into a more engineering role. I really wanted to understand, electricity as a commodity, as the product of, our utility company. How does it get to my house? I had worked at Con Edison for a few years at that point and didn't have a full kind of understanding of our distribution grid. And especially as renewables were starting to come online and we were really sourcing greener sources of energy, it really, piqued my interest. So moved into engineering. So I worked in distribution engineering for a few years there, really just understanding the equipment that makes the system run, understanding, quality of the equipment, and then moving more into how do we build the grid out more? What changes are coming because of, all of these renewables? And, Con Edison actually is celebrating its 200-year anniversary this year. And, for a very long time, the grid worked a very certain specific way. There was generation on one end and the end use customer on the other. And, over the past few years, there's been tons more changes to the grid and the engagement with customers. And so that led me to where I am now, which is in the e-mobility and demonstrations group at Con Edison. And more specifically, my role is the program manager for our commercial managed charging program, which will be launching later this year. And so it's sort of been a very well-rounded career thus far. And I know Stacy mentioned this, but I will echo the sentiment of staying at Con Edison for so long is I feel like I've had, different jobs at different companies, but the benefit of staying within the same company and the benefit of like having the same contacts and kind of strengthening those relationships even more without actually having to leave. And I mentioned that, you know, I have a business background, but I spent time in a very technical engineering group, which I don't know that I would have had that opportunity if I had just applied for that job to, you know, another company. So I've also been awarded and sought after kind of different opportunities and have been able to move around in the company to do that, which I think is a really large benefit. Also, growth for myself personally, continuing education is really something that has been huge at Con Edison. I managed to, you know, go to school for my MBA while I was working full time, and I mean that's a huge benefit. I think to know that professionally as well as personally, that's something that you know, the utility has kind of pushed on me. So yeah, I think those are the biggest things. You know, being able to continue to grow and learn and kind of take on new challenges has really kept me here so far.
I just a couple of quick follow-ups, Davey, for you one is, do they still have this program that you got into Con Ed in?
The leadership development program. Yep.
Okay.
It's a pretty competitive and intense program that I think is now it's still being marketed to, you know, college graduates and folks that are kind of early on their career. Yeah.
Okay. And the other question is sort of related. You know, a lot of people move jobs when they go back to school. You know, I'm going back to grad school. I might be changing my career. I mean, that was my own path for myself. But you stayed at Con Ed while you were in school. Tell us a little bit about how that worked out for you and why you stayed while you were in school.
Yeah, I stayed while I was at Con Edison because a lot of what I was learning was applicable in my professional life at Con Edison. So I found I could actually transfer those skills. And even after, you know, Con Edison pushes their employees to continue their education. And, you know, shortly after I graduated from my my program, I got a promotion at Con Edison. So I felt, you know, hey, I did this great thing and it was an accomplishment. I felt proud of it, but I also felt myself developing in the same company or continuing to develop, I should say.
Yeah, really interesting. So sort of related, and this is back to both of you, is on tenure. You know, what we saw with the data from the government about tenure, people are staying at their jobs a little bit longer now than they used to. And the fact that tenure actually has a positive effect on productivity. I wonder if that's been your experience as well. Do you feel like you become more productive as you've been there and you kind of are really owning the job as you get there, and what the value is of sticking around? Why don't we start with Stacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think of tenure as like, you know, stale, complacent, but it's also, I mean, to Davey and I think are good examples of growth, that institutional knowledge. I mean, we're still in a pretty nascent industry, but even with the last, you know, 10, 12, 13 years, you know, the fact that we've been kind of in it and developing those subject matter expertise as well as the network, you know, the contacts, that, you know, it's important to have that longevity. And I think we see in the transportation industry a lot of, you know, moving around between companies, certainly of, you know, similar like charging station providers, for example, it might be able to apply those skills in the same way. What's also interesting maybe about that data is, you know, I'm not sure how much it includes what you may call boomerang employees. ICF is, I've certainly encountered a lot of people that may have left for one reason or another and have come back later in their career. So, you know, it may not be a cumulative tenure thing, but sort of, you know, adding the different stints together. Similar to Davey, I was able to continue my education while at ICF. I went on to get my master's while working full time, and the company was flexible enough to not only, you know, help me with that process, but also kind of give me the bandwidth in terms of workload to accommodate that. And so I wasn't looking at it as a career change opportunity. It was more developing what I was already doing, just like Davey said. So I think that, you know, if you have that support system and can see the development path, that's, you know, important to tenure and pretty correlated. And so again, you're feeling rewarded and valued in the job that you take on, that all leads to more productive workforce.
Davey, what about you in tenure?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Stacy said, and I will also throw in one of the things, and this ties back to the original question, but one of the things that I really enjoy about working for a utility is that I find it to be impactful. Infrastructure is a huge part of our lives, and I can see the changes and the programs and other types of projects like in real life. It's serving the city that I live and work in. So I think that's a big part of also why I've stayed and why I think tenure can be linked to productivity, because I think if an employee is feeling valued, but also feels like their work is impactful and meaningful, that's really a huge bonus in keeping someone.
Yeah. No, I definitely can relate to that, especially when it comes to doing meaningful work.
I think it's also worth acknowledging, sorry, Nick, just real quick, is that I think there are people that they're just wired to move jobs. I don't think it's necessarily a reflection on their employer or the type of work that they're doing. It's just part of their DNA to try out different things. And so, Davey and I might just be people who are, more comfortable in kind of the known quantity, or, recognizing the value of kind of staying. Certainly there's a lot of pros and cons either way. And I think that people can be equally as productive in those kind of short-term engagements, but I still think that we all need to build toward, something in the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, but from what I can tell, from both of your experiences, you've both felt like you've had many different jobs within the same company, which I think is a clear value add for the company being able to offer that to you. Davey, I want to talk a little bit more about Con Ed. I studied electrical engineering in undergrad. So when I was coming out of school quite a long time ago, the power company, the electric company, was definitely not the cool company to go work for, but then, everything was .com back then. But at some point, it was clear that there was so much movement and things happening when it comes to renewables and what was happening with tech and the grid, that would start to get clearly much more exciting. And that now we're in the middle of that transition. And, this electrification movement, if you will, is pushing all kinds of new boundaries all over the place. And so I wonder how Con Ed is able to keep up with that. Because for some generations, perhaps, things were kind of like steady state. At least it feels that way. Now things are moving so quickly, it can be hard to keep up. So I'm wondering how Con Ed is trying to adapt to that really dynamic environment.
Yeah, and to your point, like, it is a very exciting time to be part of the energy industry, and specifically working for a utility. With all of the ambitious climate goals that have been set, it's really raised the awareness, I think, of the electricity grid, the utility. I think for a long time things were sort of in a steady, sort of stable state, like you said. But with all of these goals, there's been a lot of movement. There's been a ton more customer engagement as well. Like, typically it used to just be like, oh, utility, you have your electricity bill and you have to pay it, and whatever, and that's sort of it. But now there's all these programs and marketing campaigns to kind of understand your energy usage more, how you can help and be clean and greener. And also Con Edison has really leaned into that, and in teaching more to their customers too, explaining, what's sort of going on, and how we sort of can work together. And also just the intersection of the utility company with, automakers, and, electric vehicle supply equipment companies, and all of those, pieces in between. It's not happened before. So it also really provides for interesting collaborations and kind of group work and moving towards the same goal.
Stacy, similar question to you, but different kind of framing. Consulting can be pretty stressful for people. It's always challenging. It's never boring, for sure. And folks that I've known that have been in consulting have experienced burnout. And so when I look at ICF job postings, not because I'm applying for a job, but like just because I'm doing some maybe competitive research, I see ICF talk a lot about, work-life balance and things of that nature, which sound a little bit counterintuitive in the consulting space. So tell me, what is ICF doing to keep your employees on like a stable ground from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the employer certainly has part of the responsibility. The individual has some of that responsibility, but I'll start with the ICF side. And yes, consulting and really professional services, client-facing services can be stressful. You're usually kind of on call a lot, under deadlines, needing to, certainly keep within sometimes tight budgets, and that can all, be quite stressful. It also can be incredibly rewarding, actually forging true relationships with the clients that you work with, learning, on the fly in many cases, being able to apply lessons learned across different projects. But again, you're kind of always on. It's hard to separate.
Mhm.
And, even like when we go to conferences, for example, I mean, everyone kind of lets loose in different ways, but we're still working because we're still, kind of maintaining those connections and learning from each other.
Yeah.
ICF, we have certainly now, as everyone's kind of getting back into the office, whatever that might be, very encouraging of, kind of a hybrid, remote, whatever really works for the employee and the team, which is really helpful. And so in my case, I have two young girls. And so being able to, log off and grab them and take them to one sport, or volunteer for a field trip and things like that, I have that flexibility as long as I communicate with my team and with my clients as needed. So that's certainly helpful and appreciated. Also, I have a lot of really great mentors and examples internally of that work-life balance. Or I shouldn't even say that, because I don't think work-life balance exists, but trying to maintain sanity on a day-to-day basis. I've got real examples of people who have been able to make it work. So I think that's important as well, as those true relationships that you can kind of go to and bounce things off
Mhm.
of. How are you feeling about this? How are you dealing with this situation? Whatever it might be. And then it's on the individual too. I mean, regardless of what organization you're with, to set boundaries as you need to. I think everyone's willing to put in late hours, weekend hours as needed, but it can't be it's not sustainable to do that on a continual basis. So certainly flagging when you're feeling overloaded so you can work with managers. I've had really great managers throughout my tenure at ICF who are very responsive when I do raise my hand, because I know I'm probably pretty serious about it if I'm I'm crying uncle.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, I think it all goes down to back to the relationships, but also the trust that you have, with the people that you're working with, to be able to kind of take on different things, share the load, so it's not all on one person. That comes with time, and so those are important to kind of keep in mind as you're putting your time in and maintaining those relationships.
So you started out as, I forget the early titles at ICF, but associate of some sort, and now you're a VP. So you are that boss. And so I wonder if you could share a little bit about how you're working with your team to try to encourage a good work life
Yeah.
balance of sorts. That, I know you don't like that term, but something like that. I try to do that at Atlas to the best I can too, where we always talk about load and how much time you have, and trying to avoid having to get into overtime and that sort of thing. So tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about how you're doing that now in the position of leadership.
Yeah, it's something that I'm really sensitive to, because as competitive as the job market is right now, you can easily lose people, for a number of reasons, and burnout is certainly one of them. I mean, they can, recognize that maybe a different situation is better for them, and I'm supportive of that. I mean, I want anyone that I'm working with to grow, whether it's at ICF or away from ICF. But
Hmm.
we do work very closely on the projects that we're engaged in, so that kind of lends itself to checking in with each other, and recognizing when someone might be feeling a little overloaded, and doing our best to kind of share that load. As a manager, I like to say, how can I help you? What can I take off your plate? Let's figure this out. And I'm honest with with those remarks. I'm not just saying that to give lip service. I truly, we should all be willing to kind of pitch in and help out. But again, recognizing that it's fine to do that in the short term, but you need to think ahead from a staffing perspective. And like you said, we are hiring, and so that process takes time, but it's short-term pain for long-term gain, ideally. So I like to try to set a good example as well. Again, with a family and other demands on my time, it just kind of happens that I'm popping in and out sometimes, or putting in hours at odd times, but also making sure everyone is not feeling obligated to do the same that I am too. So just all in the communication and delivery, but also just being a sounding board when people are feeling. I want them to trust, to feel comfortable coming to me and saying this is too much, or I'm having this issue, and just work through it together.
Yeah, I hear you on the trying to set a good example. I was just home with my daughter, who was sick a little bit this morning, so I feel that. So let's stick with you for a minute about recruiting, because you brought that up. We've got big laws coming out of Washington, lots of hiring happening in our space right now. How is ICF adapting with this increased competition, lots of new companies entering the space, when it comes to hiring, and how are you encouraging your team to stick together, your existing team?
Yeah, it's challenging because, again, I think that the job market's competitive for a lot of reasons. Other organizations are paying a lot more in relative terms. They're also providing different benefits. Someone may want to travel more or less or whatever, and so it's a very individual decision about to look into those opportunities. With ICF, we're a large company, very stable, from a job security perspective overall. So that's certainly attractive. We do have, strong benefits, in addition to kind of, what you consider typical things like healthcare and those sorts of things. We've got, tuition stipends and other, kind of benefits that may not come front of mind. The flexibility and, that's hard to put a number around, but, again, I'm kind of an example of someone who works from home and kind of shapes hours as needed. And then the reputation that ICF has, we're doing so much in the climate space in particular. We've stood up the ICF Climate Center. There's just so many great projects going on that I think people have a lot of respect for the company and the work that we're doing and the clients that we're supporting. So that helps from both a recruiting and a retention perspective. So, I think we're in a good place. Like you said, there's so much happening, and it's hard to get people's attention regardless of what you're hiring for. But, it's an exciting place to be. And again, kind of those development opportunities, making sure people know that from the start, that you're not going to, kind of level out. And at ICF, we continue to move people around if we need to, and certainly kind of that upward trajectory.
Yeah. So similar question for you, Davey, about, the dynamism of this, movement right now with transportation electrification. Lots of startups entering the space. I'm sure that some of them are pulling people from Con Ed into their companies. And so I'm sure they're trying, or at least they're trying to do that. So what are the good and not so good parts about utility folks joining these startups? If they do leave Con Ed, but they're, nearby as a vendor or a customer of Con Ed, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Tell us about how that's perceived within the utility.
Yeah, I think that it's a good thing mostly. Kind of going back to what I was saying in terms of awareness and education. I don't know how many people really think of their utility that much, but if you buy an EV, or if you are, installing solar panels, if you are part of, the smart, like thermostat program, things like that, things that all have to do with energy, like those are all more recent, 10, 20 kind of years sort of things that have been happening. And even with transportation electrification, it's happening even more, right, with the EV adoption. So I think it's a good thing sometimes when utility folks move around in the space. Like, they're still in the space. They're able to kind of even bring that awareness more to the public and other companies about, utility challenges and the importance of the electricity grid. A lot of times all you hear about utilities can potentially be bad, but in these instances, hearing about Con Edison partnering in an innovative, new pilot to test out like V2X or Smart Grid, or, any number of kind of innovative projects is a good thing. And then having folks in those startups and in the space still is helpful. I will also say, because of that, there's also, I think, a more pointed effort to share knowledge, within the company itself, as well as, succession planning is something that, always is happening, but really thinking about that more is something that is interesting. But also, I should say, like, I'm hiring, our team is growing like crazy, to really kind of handle these new jobs and new growth opportunities. And I will say that people putting in their applications to these jobs are not like the typical, what you would think, like, like yourself, Nick, as an electrical engineer, you have quite, diversity in the educational background that I don't really remember seeing like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's interesting what's happening.
Yeah. What do you have any insights into why you think right now more people from different backgrounds are coming in wanting to apply for jobs at Con Ed?
I think because people are really realizing how much energy infrastructure is valuable. I think there's a larger focus too in the college level on sustainability. There's tons of programs that market that in some way, sustainability, urban planning. So, folks are going into policy as well, but also thinking about the world differently, and climate change as a whole, right? So we're getting that diversity, which I think is really interesting, and really thinking about things in a different way, right?
Yeah, someone who works with utilities, I'd say, David, you mentioned earlier, like the customer engagement is different. More people are thinking about utilities as, technology providers, innovators. That wasn't the case like even a couple of years ago. So I think that's part of why, there's a lot more interest in moving into that space. But I totally agree with like the cross-pollination and the value of, almost like you think about like a fellowship, throughout the industry, like the automakers being able to translate knowledge to the utilities and all the other pairings. I mean, that happens in like working groups and certainly in partnerships, but even more effective if it's kind of from inside the organization.
Is there, Stacy, David was talking about sort of different types of folks applying for jobs nowadays than previously. Is that what you're experiencing too, or is it always been kind of the way it is?
I think, yeah, the positions that I've hired for have been pretty like, multi disciplinary. It's not necessarily we're always looking for someone with a policy background, tend not to be super technical, but now we're actually looking for sometimes a little bit more analytical. And a lot of times I think it's just recognizing maybe where you have gaps in your existing workforce and trying to fill that. So much for me in the recruiting and hiring, kind of tasks that we've got is like the gut feel of who's going to be a good fit within your team, with your clients, with the type of work, the pace of work. So, what's on a resume is fantastic and certainly, gets the attention, but you do have to have a conversation with somebody to understand, those different dynamics. And I think that's ultimately what leads to the hiring decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate you both joining me to talk about such a important issue, I think, for our space more generally. I like to say, if you stay at a company for a year or two, you can definitely be a participant. You can contribute to something. It's really hard, though, to build something from the ground up in just a year or two. It takes often almost a year, especially a large organization, to even establish yourself and get your bearings on everything that's going on. So the amount of stuff that companies are trying to build these days, it's going to take some folks sticking together. Yeah. And so hopefully the inspiration from you both will inspire more folks to try to build that tenure at their shops, because I think we're going to need more of that in the near future. So that brings us to a close. I just want to say thanks to my guests, Stacy and Davey. And I'm Nick Nigro, your host of EV Hub Live. We'll be back again soon. Thanks so much. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.